It's Chelsea,
It's Nina.
and you're in the Critics' Kingdom.
So this week we are actually going to be tackling a all-time favorite DCOM. I feel like this is one of the most classic ones that they've ever done. It is Eddie's $1 Million Cook-Off.
Dun, 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 dun.
Yes, and it came out in 2003, so still in that like crazy run that Disney had. The chokehold they had over us as children from the years 1999 to about 2005 is insane. And so yes, this came out during that initial run and also stars Taylor Ogden and then co-stars our friend Orlando Brown. So, and I think right when that's when Raven had just started this year, that like in 2003, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah,
So,
Orlando Brown was doing his like Disney circuit. His face was in a lot of places during this time, I remember.
Yeah. So, Nina, if you would like to give us a recap on this classic DCOM.
Oh, would I ever, Chelsea? Eddie's $1 Million Cook-Off. So we begin with the absolutely atrocious, partly destructive practice for the Groundhogs. I guess Little League, right? It's still Little League when they're like under 15, right? Whatever. So. We're going to call it Little League. For the Groundhog Little League team, on which our star, Eddie Ogden, is the, like, you know, he's the star player of the team. Really the only thing that is their saving grace, and his dad is the coach of said team. So we watched like all of these kids like just like be terrible with this ball. And we get the sense that, you know, they're pretty much the worst team in the league, but at least they have Eddie. So we go through practice, and, you know, towards the end of practice, two sort of like things happen. The coach, who we will find out is Eddie's dad, he learns from the assistant coach that like scouts are going to see another one of the teams play. And, you know, he's like, why are they going to see that team? Like, Eddie's the best player in the league. And the other coach is like, you know why? Because our practices are like disastrous. And, you know, Eddie can't really like, he shines on the team as like being decent, but he can't shine in the league because he's on the worst team, essentially. And we see that after practice, like the highlight of practice seems to be that Eddie makes these, you know, very special Eddie dogs, these like wonderful hot dogs for his friends that they like, it's the highlight of, you know, the season is like, they've been waiting for them like all year is I think what one of his best friends, DB, says. So after the game, you know, they all go back to Eddie's house. Well, not all of them, like Eddie and his two best friends go back to Eddie's house, and we see that, you know, he lives with his, you know, it's his dad, his mom. He has two older twin brothers who we assume are in high school. Eddie is starting 8th grade this year. And, yeah, you know, it's just like, it's a lot of like boys roughhousing. That's like the best way to describe it, you know, and like wrecking things. And in the process of that, they wreck some stuff, and their mom starts bleeding, and their dad like faints at the sight of blood. So mom, dad, and twin brothers like all collectively go to the hospital because, you know, like his dad, ironically enough, is weak. But, you know, we also saw Eddie earlier, like he happened upon Bobby Flay on TV, and he like seemed kind of interested in it. And so like, his mom had asked him to put away the groceries, and like he and his friends are like about to put away the groceries, and Eddie's like, hold on, what if we cook this instead? And both of his friends, who are both boys, are like, excuse me, like what? That made no sense. And Eddie's like, I got this. So they kind of, you know, they start cooking up a storm, and it's a little bit disastrous at first, but, you know, Eddie's kind of getting the hang of it. And he, you know, we watch him put Fruit Loops on chicken. We watch him do a lot of things that seem kind of crazy. But, you know, when his family gets home, they had brought home pizzas, but Eddie's like, we cooked for you. Let's try this dinner. And at first his brothers are like, we're not touching that. Like, absolutely no way. Nobody's eating anything that Eddie cooked. But like, then like jump cut, the food is gone. People are fighting over the last scraps. So like, yo, Eddie's got some talent, right? Like we could see the boy can cook. So then at school, we see that they're like signing up for electives, And Eddie's essentially been told by his older brothers who have been through this already that, like, yo, computer science is a class to take. You get to play video games for homework. It's like super duper easy. Like, take computer science. And when they're signing for electives, there's like so he convinces all his friends to do that too. So they're signing for electives, and there's like a herd of people, and the clipboards get knocked down. And like 2 clipboards end up next to each other, and it's home ec and computer science. And Eddie like knows that like he's supposed to sign for computer science, but there's just something in him, you know. Home ec is just calling his name. So he tricks his friends into signing up for home ec with him, and they all end up in this home ec class. And Eddie like kind of has to play it off like he didn't mean for that to happen. He's like, yo man, like I'm sorry I grabbed the wrong clipboard. Like I'm so sorry. And in the class it's him, his best friend DB, his best friend Frankie, and then like this other like another person on their baseball team, Hannah, who she's only in there because like she has this whole thing with her mom where like she thinks that her mom wants her to like be a cheerleader and like not play sports and all that stuff. So that's why she's in home ec. So the first day in home ec, you know, they meet Bridget, who has the girl's from New Zealand. It's not explained what she's doing here in anywhere America. I think they're trying to pretend like she's not from New Zealand, but it don't make no sense. She sounds very strange. And she also is she's that like type A, you know, sort of like section asshole of the class. Like she's like, like, you know, like I'm great at this, and like the rest of you are plebs. She's playing that game. But you know, in that first day of home ec, they find out about Mrs. Hadley, who's the home ec teacher, tells them about this competition called the $1 Million Cook-Off. And, you know, it piques Eddie's interest, but he has to feign like completely not caring because, you know, he's there with his friends. But at the end of the class, he like sneaks back in and just takes a brochure. So then we see him go home, and like that night, he's like up because to enter into the competition, you have to submit an original recipe, and like a completely original dish. So he's at home trying to figure out like an original dish just by like tasting things and sees what works. He tries a whole bunch of different stuff. The kitchen is a mess. The boy don't know how to use a blender to save his life. There's peanut butter and jelly all over the dog. It's a whole situation. But and he almost gets caught because his older brother wakes up in the middle of the night and comes downstairs, and he like hides and turns off the lights and everything because we're really supposed to feel how ashamed he is of enjoying cooking. But his brother like picks up a sandwich and like eats it and is like, oh, this is good, and like takes it upstairs. So we do see that Eddie is probably like on the right track, and again, like natural talent for this situation. So the next day at school, or like a couple days later, the timeline is a little bit unclear, but you know, at school later on, he kind of like butters up Bridget a little bit, and he's trying to like, you know, share some trade secrets with her. He's like, oh, you know, just like, I'm just curious, like, what are you entering, and and all this stuff. And his friends see him talking to Bridget, and they're like, yo, what are you doing, dude? She sucks. And he's like, I'm actually just like kind of making fun of her. Like I'm not even like really talking to her. And she's like, what are you talking about? That's not true. Why are you being so weird and an ass? But like it turns into like a whole situation that fundamentally ends up with Eddie distracting everybody by starting a food fight with DB. So there's a huge food fight in the home ec room, and it's like, you know, they all have to clean up afterwards. And when they're cleaning up, Frankie, who's, you know, Orlando Brown's character, he like sees some purple goo and decides to eat it because apparently that's something that children do, is just eat things that they see. And he's like, whoa, this is incredible. And Eddie tastes it and is like, oh my goodness, like this is so, so good. And pretty much decides, we see him go home and he decides that like that's what he's going to try to recreate to be his original recipe. And he succeeds at that. He like manages to make the purple goo in another night of disastrous kitchen cooking. But when he goes to submit it, he like overhears Bridget and Mrs. Hadley talking and essentially learns that, you know, what Mrs. Hadley has been saying, cooking is a science, it's exact. Like, you have to have an exact recipe that you submit as well with, you know, the prepared dish, because like otherwise you're automatically disqualified. So now he's like freaking out about it, and he's at home and he's trying to like figure out what to do, and is essentially caught by his mom. And his mom is like, okay, so wait, you like to cook? Is that what this is? Like, you want to do this cook-off? Like, great. And he's like, yeah, but please don't tell dad. Like, we can't tell dad. And his mom is at first like, oh, your dad might be understanding. And then she's like, wait, no, he won't. Because throughout all of this, like, his dad has been very, very much like pushing Eddie, and like just constantly talking about how like Eddie needs to do really well at baseball, and Eddie has so much talent at baseball, and like that is essentially just like a line for his future, even though Eddie has never expressed any interest in ever wanting to be a professional baseball player. But, you know, clearly, you know, kids pick up on things, and he's very aware that like his dad wants him doing a certain thing, and his dad probably wouldn't approve of this cooking. So he's doing all this in secret now with his mom's help. And he gets in. It's like awesome. Like, he gets in. Well, we think it's awesome. Everybody at school is laughing at him. His father is like, what do you mean he's in a cooking competition and no one told me? Oh, so like no one wants to tell me anything now. Like, people think they can't talk to me, and it's okay to keep secrets. So like, even though it's a great accomplishment, Eddie actually just ends up feeling really bad about this. And he feels like he's letting his team down. He feels like everybody at school is constantly making fun of him. His brothers keep calling him Edwina. Like, it's just it's a whole mess. And then he's roped into it extra, like, further, because, like, his own home ec teacher is like, y'all aren't going to go and embarrass me, so you have to come and do, like, cooking training, technical training, like, after school. And that starts to interfere with his, like, baseball practice. And, like, for once, the Groundhogs are actually doing pretty okay, and they want to keep winning now that they started winning, and, like, they see Eddie as, like, the big, you know, a huge part of that. So, like, this continues for a little bit, and it gets to a point where, like, Eddie is being so berated by his friends that he actually ends up getting, and he's, like, neglecting baseball so much that he ends up getting into a huge fight with his best friend, DB, who just, like, doesn't get it, and is like, this is weird, and it's stupid, and I don't understand why you want to cook and not play baseball. Like, how do you not just want to win? And that fight sort of pushes Eddie to, like, abandon cooking for the most part. He's like he decides to focus fully on baseball, which seems to make his dad and all his friends happy. And they play like the game, like the final like qualifying game for the playoffs, and they win. And the playoffs are going to be the same day as the cook-off. So it's a thing where Eddie, he's pretty much made a decision, but, you know, they're celebrating, and his teacher shows up at the house, Mrs. Hadley, and she's like, listen, I just want to, like, Eddie's sort of quit this thing, and I don't think he should. I think he should come to the competition tomorrow. Like, I think he's really talented, all of that, you know, like a good teacher stuff. And, you know, they, like, the idea is that Eddie will sleep on it and decide. He sleeps on it. We see him go to the competition, like earlier in the day, and see the setup, and his eyes are glazed, and everything's just amazing. And he talks to Bobby Flay for a second. But he's like, I can't let my team down. Like, I gotta go play this game. So he goes to the game, and like, he's playing okay, and like, but he's obviously distracted. And, you know, Frankie has the TV on because he's like, it's cool that Eddie's name is on TV no matter what. Like, I think that that's dope. And essentially, like, as the game is going on, they like Frankie and Hannah pretty much like read DB a riot act of like, why are you being such an ass to him? Like, making him feel like he can't, like, this is a really cool thing that he's giving up to, like, play this game. And, like, why should we always rely on Eddie? So DB essentially, like, uses some reverse psychology to convince Eddie to get the hell off the field and, like, go to the cook-off. And meanwhile, his dad has also been read a riot act by all of the children who are like, you misogynist pig. Can you please stop saying when someone runs bad that they run like a girl? Stop making fun of other team players because their parents are like, their dad is a nurse. My dad's a nurse. And another one's like, my dad's a florist. And like, why can't he just throw bad? Why does he have to throw like a girl? I'm a girl. That would make no sense. So it's a whole thing. And essentially by the end of it, like, the coach his dad realizes like, oh, like, yeah, he's been an ass and he's been putting too much pressure on his son, and he gets himself thrown out of the game so that he can go and help Eddie in the cook-off, because Eddie shows up late to that and he's the only one without any assistance. So we get to like watch him like compete in this cook-off and like race to the finish, and he just manages to get like a secret ingredient on the plate, and it's like, you know, this great thing of like, oh, like he's triumphed, and his brothers show up to like support him and like are yelling his name. And you know, it's all like a feel good thing, but then he doesn't win. Bridget wins, which makes sense because the girl's been doing this for a very long time. But you know, he doesn't win, but like his team shows up to like support him, and like everybody is just like kind of now cool with Eddie doing the thing that Eddie clearly loves. And Bobby Flay comments to, you know, his friend Frankie, like, look at him, like he's a winner already, like he's gonna be great, and he's gonna do great things because he has the support of like great people. And yeah, and so Eddie learns that it's okay to cook, and that is Eddie's $1 Million Cook-Off.
And we'll be right back with the review. So to kick off the review, I mean, I feel like I said earlier, this one was a classic one, but I think in rewatching it, we kind of noticed a lot of things that maybe we didn't pick up on when we were younger, and watching it. I know that one thing that you had mentioned, Nina, that I thought was a really good point, and something I didn't, fact that the whole movie really seems to be about how to be a good sport, and how to be a good teammate to people, and how sometimes that means like, hey, stepping back and being like, y'all need to take this yourselves, and other times stepping up and helping people train or helping people do better or whatever that means. But being a good leader and being a good teammate, is really important, and that's how you build great teams.
Yeah, and that like sort of a great team is necessary for success no matter what, you know? And like I think we even see that with like the way that at the end Bridget wins, but there's no one there. Like she's like where are her parents? Again, are they in New Zealand? Like where are her parents at? But like
Truly,
like,
they're never in this film.
She clearly has like not many friends, and even like Mrs. Hadley be coming for her sometimes. Like in home ec, she be like girl, like I think there's a point where she asks like, is that why nobody likes me because I like to cook? And Mrs. Hadley is like, no. There are many reasons why people don't like you. Like Mrs. Hadley has no time for her. But yeah, that like it's a movie that kind of constantly puts up this idea of winning, right? Which then begs the question of like, what does it mean to win? And we see it answered in like varying forms. Like sometimes that means self-reliance. Sometimes, you know what I mean? Or like being willing to like take up the mantle yourself. Sometimes that means like relying on others. Sometimes that means like just accepting and like not questioning and like sort of like, you know, loving without condition. Sometimes it means, you know, like prodding something that a status quo that already exists, you know, and challenging someone that you respect. You know, you see that with the kids and their coach when they like, by the end of the thing where they're like, can you please stop doing this? You know, and sort of speaking truth to power. We just see like it just pops up in various ways, and I think that at the end of the day, it's like its final takeaway is that like you win when you can succeed at something that you love, and you really win when you can succeed at something that you love, and there are people there to back you, who you know have your back, and who you know like you will back when the time comes as well. So like that at the end of the day, like it is all about sort of being a team sport, which is I appreciated seeing that now as an older person.
I think we saw that kind of in Full Court Miracle a bit,
yeah,
but it wasn't played out in the same way. Like I feel like this one, it very much hammers home the point that sometimes being a good teammate is, you know, letting your teammates shine on their own and allowing them to do what they need to do to get to that next level with less help with you. If you are the person, in this particular case, Eddie is like basically the savior of the team.
Mm-hmm.
He's like the best player, like hands down, and they're an overall bad team. So, you know, him being able to, you know, when DB tells him, you got to let us do our own thing, and so you can go and do what you need to do. And so on both ends, they're showing like that's what a good teammate should do. So yeah, I think that was a really good point. And something that I definitely didn't pick up on, but it's something that I think is good to get to hammer home to children.
Yeah.
It's like there's not just one way to be a good teammate or to be on a team.
Yeah, and I think especially like, not to beat this over the bush, but I think especially also just the idea of like understanding that like it is not, or it shouldn't, that pursuing something that you love should not necessarily be a version of letting down the team, because that's somewhere that like both his teammates and Eddie have, and his dad, like that's somewhere where they all have to get to, is like understanding that like Eddie finding something that he loves and like is good at and like has a natural talent for, that is different from this other thing that you guys have bonded over, isn't him letting you down. It's actually more like, if you don't allow him to pursue that, you're letting him down. You know, like it's just like understanding that it's not always, I don't know how to explain it. Like sometimes the best thing to do for the team is to step away, which is what we were saying. But like, yeah, that's the idea.
I think, and then another part that we really liked about this is in 2003 when this came out, because I looked this up, the Food Network had only come out 10 years prior, in 93. So 2003, I think, is really when you saw this type of upswing or this increase in food related content. Because I think it had been there really since like a Julia Child, and like, you know, people had like public access cooking shows for many years, but Food Network was very much, I think, the first one where it's like, this is a whole channel, that's all we're about. In the late 90s, early 2000s is really when it starts blossoming, and they started creating their own stable of people like the Bobby Flays, like the Rachel Rays. So I think this is also just an interesting one, because you're kind of seeing when food culture was really, you know, taking off, because it's so imbued in everything now, like it's so normalized. But at that point, you know, like I said, it only been out like 10 years. I don't think it was really starting to hit off to like the late 90s. So it was just very interesting kind of seeing that turning point, and when it became a thing for kids too, because I remember I grew up watching Food Network. I used to love all their competition shows. I also loved the original Iron Chef, like the original Japanese one is so good. Highly recommend if you've never seen it. I don't know if they have episodes on YouTube, but I feel like it should be somewhere around there. But then you also never want to watch Iron Chef America. I'll just tell you that now, because it is a bastardization of Iron Chef in its original form.
Or like Hell's Kitchen. I remember Hell's Kitchen was really popular when, I feel like around that age, like around 2003. That was a real. Was it? Or maybe it like started after that, but I feel like that was like,
it was part
one
of,
Gordon Ramsay, it was one of those over. It was Gordon like Ramsay one of those shows that I like.
Yeah, Gordon Ramsay coming over in general was very much like because food started to take off here in the US. And it's like crossing over.
And I wonder about the history of that, because like even just thinking about the fact that the Food Network started like at the top of the 90s, like I do wonder if there's for some reason my brain just went like 80s culture of excess, and like just the way that people were dining shifted. Very, you know, it became like, so like to think of it in the way of like in the eras of like Julia Child and like, you know, sort of, as you're saying, public access of cooking shows, like of, you know, let's say like the 50s through 60s.
The 60s.
Like those were shows that were aimed at like housewives cooking, right? Like that was the idea. But I think that like where the Food Network like really started taking off, and like the shift that we saw was like now a focus on like the prowess of chefs and like all of the amazing things that can be done with food. And like I think generally, like anthropologically, like when you see that happening, it tends to be like when the culture has reached a place of, you know, excess, when people have the money to like go out and spend a lot of money on food, or like where food can be treated less as like a survival tool and more of like something to be experimented with. Because, you know, when you broke, you don't experiment with food, you eat that. You know, like,
Right.
it is sustenance and is not to be wasted. But yeah, like there's just a little bit more like leeway and like leisure and just money and excess in the culture that allows for that to develop. And I think that Food Network, or at least the iteration of Food Network that I know of from like my younger years, very much lived in the space of look at the prowess of chefs, not in like it, like, you know, it had its few shows that were like, because you always have to have the shows that are like, oh, you know, like here's how you make chicken cordon bleu, like here's how you do that, right? But the like or like the shows that made Food Network like hyped up were all about the prowess of like people who cooked for a living, and who made it their profession.
Right. And all the competition shows, which I'm actually happy that this kind of played into, because that was really a big part of Food Network's nighttime block. Because I think that's actually how they did what you're saying, is the daytime was basically all the housewife shows.
Yeah,
Obviously that's not being demeaning to housewives, but what I would put in that category of like, you know, Semi Homemade with Sarah Lee, and like, you know, all those shows where it's, or Giada, you know, where it's like that's happening from like 9 a.m. to like 2 p.m. when the people who are home at a certain point in history were typically the women, and they were cooking. So
and then they do all the informational ones, like Unwrapped would be at like 3-4 p.m. when like kids got home
and Good Eats. Good Eats. And then you
know,
the nighttime block, which would be all the like Iron Chefs, all the baking competition shows, like all the like Rachel Ray eating on $40 a day, like all of that kind of. Oh, I used to love that show so much. But yeah, you would have all the like competitive shows where they're showing like skill and prowess. That was like the nighttime block. So yeah, I think they literally separated it. I think they still separate it like that even to this day.
They do.
Yeah, because even Chopped, I want to say, comes on at like 9 p.m.
Yeah, that's prime time. That's primetime television.
Literally. And you know, I think something else that is related to this that we spoke about and that this movie shows very pointedly was the idea of like masculinity, and how there are how we gender professions. And I don't even think this is not solely an American thing. This is all over the world. I think, especially with like capitalism. But
there's like
very much gender professions.
Yeah, there's like a basic sort of like historically, like anthropologically rooted kind of theory that essentially like when society gets to the place, or civilization gets to the place where there is enough leisure for like the profession to happen, you know, like when it moves from egalitarian society, because of excess, so people have more time to do things and people can become specialized in what they do. Everybody doesn't have to work a farm to survive. Professions begin to develop, but what we tend to see is that when things move from being utilitarian to sort of being in the realm of craft and technique, there tends to be a gender, if not switching, a concentrated like sort of gender rising, I guess, just I don't know what the exact term would be, that happens. So for example, when ceramics are being made just to be like bowls to eat from, or like clothes are just being made to be worn, like, you know, just to have clothing, like those tend to fall into the realm of like household work, like women's work often. But like when there's more leisure and like when they become crafts, or like when they become ceramics, and you know, when you have like shops in keramikos and like the specialized technique of like making a trophy vase for oil, right? Then suddenly like it is now kind of exclusively male or exclusively masculine. It is no longer considered part of like the household and therefore part of like women's duties. So like professions sort of anthropologically and like historically have lived in a very masculine, male dominated space. But I think that like kind of something we were talking about was that even in that space, they then get gendered. So like we have a society where like it's not, oh, you're a CEO and you're just a CEO, right? And like also like people expect the CEO to be a man, and then like, oh, you're a CEO, so that's cool. It's like, no, like there is a difference between being a CEO who like drills for oil and the CEO who makes dresses. Like those are considered two different, like you are considered more or less of a man, even though it is a position that fundamentally does the exact same thing, because of the product that you create. And like that just like is a very interesting thing to me, and to me potentially a symptom of one of many symptoms of something that is, you know, very wrong with the way that we consider gender in this society.
Yeah, and I think you even see it, you know, I think it's pretty much anything that's seen as inherently feminine. It's common, you know, like Nina was saying, like with fashion, you know, a lot of the fashion designers, most fashion designers are men. And they're the ones who are given the agency and are like given the money and the finance to become, you know, create their own houses, especially once you get into like high-end fashion, like couture and such. But then also the people who own all of these big fashion brands, like, you know, you think of LVMH or Kering, it's men. So even with that, you see the same thing, even in distinctly quote unquote male professions. They normally have a female, they normally have a female, uh, not lower profession, but a female, I'm just thinking of like something like doctors and nurses, how doctors are typically thought to be male and then nurses are typically thought to be women. And you know, even within that, which is like medicine was a very male profession, but then the only way that women were able to get into it for a long time, you had to be a nurse. That was it. There was no way that you could become a doctor for many years. So you know, it's like you always kind of see these breakdowns in various professions in our society. But yes, as soon as it becomes something that's like something that can be professional, then men take over. And I think in this movie they specifically tackle it because you see how his father, Eddie's father, refers to everything under gendered ways. So it's like, oh, you throw like a girl, you run like a girl, you're, you know, the other coach is a nurse. Did you know that? Like it's just like all these like little things that he just constantly is saying, and constantly saying around the kids too. And they pick up
like
on
in saying
it
to them,
and they pick up on it, and until the end when, you know, they all basically are like, we're not doing this shit anymore, like we're not allowing this male chauvinist man to tell us what women and men can't do. And you know, that's when they start, you know, when one of the boys is like, my dad's a nurse too, and the girl's like, my dad's a florist, XYZ. And
Hannah's like, why can't I just be a part of the team? Why do I have to be one of the guys?
Right,
like,
exactly.
It's dumb.
And I do think gendered language especially is so pervasive. I think that's all over the world though, because I think even when you get to the like the romance languages specifically, where everything is literally gendered, in a way that does not exist in English in quite the same way, but you see it especially in those languages like in Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, where everything ends in an O or an A depending on who's saying what and to who they're saying it to. And so I think it's honestly just like a worldwide thing, but it is one of those things that we really need to like dismantle those systems overall. I do understand that that's very difficult, but I do think that's kind of like the only way that you can get rid of it, because what it's really doing is just upholding a patriarchy and upholding, you know, a masculinity that's toxic and is negatively affecting women, but is also negatively affecting men, which people don't bring up. And I'm like, men are more likely to die earlier than women. Many of them are stressed. They're also like, I think 2 times more likely to commit suicide than women here in the US. And so it's like, it's literally killing y'all and it's killing us. So it's just like these simple, it may seem like these things are unrelated, but it's also, that's how these structures and these systems are how we uphold that. and how it just keeps becoming so pervasive in our society, where kids are growing up with that, and you're wondering how they're 20 years old and hate women, you know? It's because of little things like this, or just structural things like this. So I really like that the movie did tackle that like head on, and was literally just showing like, because that's how a lot of, especially when we were growing up, like that was a very common refrain to hear. You throw like a girl, or you run like you do something like a girl, and that was a negative thing, and you knew that.
Yeah.
But anything you did like a boy was a positive.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think that like it gets like I get, for me, like language gets weird because I don't know, like you know this. I don't know if our listeners have picked up on this, but like I've studied a decent amount of like historical linguistics, and you know, I sort of studied language. Like that was kind of my shtick. And I guess like my thing is, I think it's like it's weird because it's like, well, I do think that like systems, it's okay. I live in a place of like, my issue lies less in the phrase "you run like a girl," more so in like the fact that the implication exists within the phrase. And I don't necessarily believe that the phrase itself holds the implication. I think that we put it on it, right? So like, I don't necessarily think that like, because like, for example, like, you know, like in Latin, like the word for farmer is a feminine word. It definitely is a masculine connotation that it has, though. It's just like, that's just the way that the word is built. And I mean, like, I wasn't alive in Rome, so I really can't 110% speak to it. But from what I have seen of like, and my engagement with gendered languages has, ironically enough, existed sort of more outside of the specifically Romance ones, like still Indo-European, but like, it's like the Greek and the Slavic and such. Like the gender of a word doesn't automatically always like create the toxicity of association that like I see in American society with phrases like "you run like a girl," if that makes sense. And it's a thing of like, I kind of feel like it's like, and I think I've brought this up on the podcast before, like I have an issue with just like why, like the fact that that we consider certain traits bad or good, and then we also consider them like gendered bad. You know, like most traits that are considered bad in this society fall under the category of feminine that we have created. And it's like, I think my issue is like, I feel like the language is almost sort of secondary, and it's like, it's why is emotion considered a bad trait? Why is caregiving considered a bad trait? Or like, why is it a trait that doesn't allow you to do things that a man is quote unquote supposed to do? Like, why, like, and I said this like in the film, like from the jump, I was like, I literally, it bothers me the idea that like he's immediately like berated for like, and I mean, I'm coming at this from a hindsight perspective where, you know, like now, like we've seen so much of like cooking shows and like all of that thing, like that's so pervasive in society that I think most of us do understand that like cooking is a very male dominated profession, deeply male dominated profession. Chefs are men, right? Across the board, most chefs are men. And most chefs that get paid well are men. And so like watching, I was like, I'm just confused because like why are you like, okay, like he can be a professional baseball player or he can be a professional chef. Either way, if he's good at it, he's about to make some real good money. You know what I mean? Like I think my issue is just like, I just don't understand like why is cooking feminine and bad for a 12-year-old to like, or a 13-year-old to like. Like, it's a disconnect that I think words reflect. Like, the way that we use language reflects, but I think that it happens earlier, like it's somewhere in the system sort of before that, you know? Not to saying that like we shouldn't also like use language more carefully and thoughtfully, but yeah, like I don't know, it's just like it just doesn't make sense to me. Maybe I'm too enlightened for my own good.
No, I get what you're saying in terms of like the implication and the feeling behind it is what really matters. But I also feel like at this point, they're so wrapped up in each other, you can't divorce one from the other. Like, and I think that's how I feel, because it's like, as much as I want to say that words were created and that wasn't necessarily what was meant by them, and they weren't thinking they would be using a specific phrase like, oh, you run like a girl, or when you're gendering in certain romance languages, that you just saying, oh, I'm speaking to a woman, so let me add an A at the end. It's like, I couldn't tell you like, that was necessarily the meaning behind, especially on the romance language side, but it is one of those things that it's so wrapped up at this point, and that's why a lot of people fight for it, because the language itself does matter, because at this point it's intertwined with that feeling. So I mean, it is a complicated conversation though. But I do think it is one of those things that, yeah, they're kind of one and the same at this point. Because I think that's partially why like a lot of Latine people have created the word Latine or Latinx, because they're like Latina, Latino gender immediately. Like, even if it wasn't created like that, at this point, that's what it is. So we want to create a language or a word to describe what we are without having that gender. And I think you have the same thing here with you run like a girl. It probably wasn't created with that in mind, because, it just wasn't. But now that's what it's become. But yeah, I think it is definitely an interesting conversation. I do think the overall implication behind why we say certain things is the big part of it. And yeah, I mean, I just think that the inherent masculinity, and also the fact that it passes down so easily from the father to the brothers, because I think that's also a typical refrain that's used from people. If they're like, oh, well, the next generation, they're not going to think like that. They're not going to be like that. They're not going to be this, male chauvinist type. And it's like, well, no, they're still growing up in the household with these people. Like their father is like that, or their uncle or their grandfather, or whatever. And you constantly hear that from when you're younger to when you're older, that you're superior to a degree to a woman, because clearly if you're saying you run like a girl, you throw like a girl to me in a negative connotation, I'm going to think, oh, okay, anything to do with women, lesser than. So then by the time you get to, his brother's age, when I guess they're like 16 or 17 because they were driving, like it's just so ingrained, you don't even think about it. It's just like, oh yeah, of course we're going to call him Edwina, because you know who cooks? Mom. And you know what that means? She's like lesser than me. And it's like, not saying that that's the exact thought process, but that's basically what it is. Like you're connecting those dots that you learned at like 6 years old as a young boy or girl, or, so yeah, I think it's just so ingrained. But I do like that they directly tried to tackle it, and then also directly had the kids call it out.
Yeah.
But I do want to note, when we talked about this, was that their black male coach, Coach Longo, who was present during this entire film, truly never said anything to Eddie's father, their head baseball coach. Even at the end, he never said anything. He just nodded with all the kids and was like, you should work on that. And like, that was it.
Which, like, yeah, I mean, like, we all have to have the conversation about, complicity by people who should maybe also have a strong idea of what it feels like to be repressed by a society, and therefore not be complicit in the perpetuation of the repression by others, just because it's like gender versus race. But I mean, like, we don't have to have that conversation. We could have that conversation. But yes, it was, we did both find it interesting that was his black male coach, assistant coach, that really just let it happen, and never said anything. and the children had to stand up for themselves.
Yeah, and I just think in general, men need to stop being complicit in this kind of stuff. even just these little things that you hear your friends or your fathers or your, your male colleagues, whatever, say, a lot of it, because of how the patriarchy and misogyny is set up, they don't listen to women who complain about this constantly. They will listen to other men though, because they see you
Yeah.
as an equal typically. So
Yeah.
I do think a lot more men need to stop being complicit in that, because that is literally how this patriarchy and these systems continue, because y'all don't call each other out. Like, accountability needs to be had, and y'all need to hold each other accountable because you're the ones who are actively like doing it, So not saying women can also be complicit. That is also, it also gets ingrained in us, because I'm not acting like, we're in two completely separate societies. We're not. Or not in that way. So, women can also be complicit, but I think men need to also hold each other accountable and call each other out when they see that kind of thing happening.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's all very wrapped up in itself as like the best of our. I don't want to inherently use the word oppressive. They end up being quite oppressive, but our sort of like placement and like status building systems are. But like, and I think even in that, like something else that we noted was like the way in which, like, I think as we were both watching it, we were both like lamenting the fact that we didn't have home ec in school when we were like coming up. And then I think I said something like, oh, but like, yeah, but like my mom like teaches at a technical school, and she teaches culinary arts there, So I'm like, oh, home ec like still exists. It's just like in a particular school, and we both sort of came to this place of like thinking about and it's weird, like all these things sort of feed into each other, like another form of just like creating potentially like artificial distinctions amongst people very early that like set them up on paths for life that are like not necessarily inherent to like what would happen if you just allow people to like be who they are naturally. But like we essentially talked about how like the reason that we didn't have home ec in school is because like schools have very much like gone away from a sort of all-inclusive track, and like now like kids are tracked like really early, and schools are set up like, or like the higher you get in education, it's set up so that like there are school for those who are academic and intellectual, and the managerial creative class, to so to speak, like the ones who will run the companies, and then there are schools set up for like the technology and the ones who will make the thing. And everybody has to like take English and math, but like in one school you're getting classes on like media literacy, and in the other school you're getting woodshop or home ec, or something of that nature. And not never, but rarely the twain shall meet, as it currently exists. And yeah, just a sort of basic questioning of like, I don't know, like we live in a place, we live in a time where there is a lot of conversation right now about the gap in wealth, the gap between the haves and the have-nots, like how we have entered into essentially a feudal society, an oligarchical society, where like very few with a wild abundance of excess control just the entire running of the world, and the space between what can be gotten by the masses and what can be amassed by those at the top is huge and constantly growing. And like this, like the tracking in schools, and like this splitting, this sort of early delineation between like essentially the managerial and the laboring class is, another form of just like something potentially quite toxic and oppressive of our current societal system.
Yeah, and I think, because we were talking about it, and I was just thinking about like I was talking to my dad not too long ago, and just about like how he came up he was in high school in the 70s. I want to say like early 70s. And he was telling me that in his high school, and they had recently been integrated because, that time period, he got integrated in 7th grade because that's when it hit Tennessee, even though that was like 12 years after Brown versus Board. But anyways, when it hit his small town in Tennessee, but he was telling me that all of the guys were told to take agriculture at that time, and all the girls did home ec. And my grandmother apparently was like, "You're not going to be a farmer, so I don't know why you're taking agriculture." but it just made me think like, oh, but that used to be like, you could learn that type of thing. Like, that was at your average high school. You had home ec, you had agriculture, you had wood shop, you had those types of things. And like, maybe, the women weren't taking agriculture. I think there were some, but it is very interesting to see how we have, in one way, all come together in certain aspects, but then at the same time have like different, like we have literally chopped up things so small that you now have such a much more stratified culture. I think, like you were saying, where like you're not learning, like a liberal arts college does not mean you're learning, I think, as much as you used to, or like having the same sort of like well-roundedness to a degree.
At least not in a physical sense.
Yeah.
Like intellectually, there's a wide range. But it's like at Juilliard, you learn to dance and to act, and what I mean. Like, it's very sort of specific,
right? Well, and that's what I'm saying. But even because I would say that that's actually different than a liberal art. Like, when I'm saying liberal arts, I mean like, yeah, I mean like a Williams College or like something.
I meant to put it as like, so like you have colleges where you are learning technical things,
right?
You are learning how to physically do stuff, and then liberal arts colleges, like, you are learning things of the mind, but you are probably not, what I mean? Like they might have a major for dance, but it's probably not a great major. What I mean? Like, it's not something that is highly respected in the space, or like that the space is sought out for.
Right.
You're there to get a mind's education.
Exactly. And I think you definitely see it at the younger level, where now, I think all over the US, it's very normal for you to like test into different selective high schools. I know for sure it's normal in New York, but I know other states do it as well. But when you do these selective high schools, they're typically magnet schools. So it's like you're going specifically to like a business high school, or you're going to a performing arts high school, or you're going to a like a tech, like we were saying, like a computer science,
like math and engineering,
and whatever it is. But like, that's what most schools are these days. Like, they've separated, because they're like, oh, it's more effective if we like focus on the specific thing, and we're really, really good at that specific thing, so we get this specific kind of kids to go up through this, versus giving them like a more all-inclusive education like they used to do. And I couldn't tell, I'm not an education specialist or whatever. Like, I don't know which one is worse, which one is the same, because honestly, it seems like we're moving more towards the European model, because that's how Europe does it. It's very much like, well, I know Spain. I'll speak specifically to Spain, and I think some of the other European countries around it, but it's very much when you get into their equivalent of 10th grade, you pick, do you want to study science or you want to study letters? And that sets you on the track for the rest of your time, because once you go to college, since they don't do liberal arts, there's no general education. Like, it's very much like, if you want to be a lawyer, you start being in law classes from day one, freshman year. So I don't know. It seems like we're going actually more towards that the more I think about it. And again, I don't know if that's better. I don't know if that's worse. It's just different. But I think it does then get a situation where we have like now where we're like, wow, I wish we did have home ec. Like, it would have been kind of nice to learn like a little how to cook. And like, one of my friends took it, but she also grew up in Saudi Arabia. So take that how you will. And went to an international school, and they made all of the girls, I think, take home ec. But she was like, we learned how to sew. We learned how to darn socks, and in addition to learning how to cook, I think they learned how to do like basic like personal finance. Like, but I'm like, that would be useful.
Yeah, I think like 110%. I think though, like I don't know what's better. I know that my issue, and like there is a certain extent to which like I feel like we talked about this on this podcast too before, where like I've definitely said that like there is a level to which like the sort of meandering approach of like liberal arts isn't helpful for a lot of people, right? To like be like, oh, you know, just pick whatever you want, like that, and like not having someone like encourage you to like follow a direction in something that you seem to be good at, like can lead to a lot of people ending up feeling like very lost once they sort of leave that bubble of education. They're like, oh wait, like I actually don't know what skills I have because I didn't develop any specifically like to a specific realm. So like I think that there's definitely like pros and cons on both sides of approach. But I think my issue with the way that I see this separation between what I will call the academic and the technical happening in this country is that like we're getting to a place where like for example, like my mom teaches culinary at a technical high school. And what I often worry about when I think about like, with like, you know, when, you know, I'm having conversations with her about like education that's happening in her school, right? And in the schools that she's sort of associated with, like the thing that starts to sort of worry me is that I'm like, it seems like we're getting to a place where like, because here's the thing, right? She's teaching culinary and hospitality. A few of those kids might one day like own their own restaurant, right? Or like own their own hotel or something of that nature. The vast majority of them will not. The vast majority of them are going to end up working in hotels, working in restaurants. Like they are part of the hospitality industry, but they are essentially on track to be servers, right? They are on track to be part of the service class. And like, I think that is the part of it that like, that just nicks at me the wrong way, is that I think that this separation, that the way that, at least the way that I see it being played out in America, is that like this separation between the academic and the technical, kind of what people complain about with like the military, with, you know, like military schools and like the fact that you can go into very, as what I understand it, very sort of like high positions of command without ever seeing battle or like without ever like being deployed. You know what I mean? Like like people who come into the military as soldiers, it's much harder for them to move up ranks as opposed to people who come into it from an academic side. And I don't know how much that still holds weight like right now, but I know that that was definitely a refrain that I heard growing up. I feel like this separation that like we are a product of, and is something that has like, that sort of really began in America, like in a really sort of deep way, like sort of in the like late 80s and like 90s, that it is creating, again, like what I would really just call like a feudal system where you take a test when you're 5 and that test suggests whether you can run a company or start a company, or you can manage some people, or you can work on a factory line, or you can, you know, serve others. And it shows like, oh, like you might be good at that. And then like, that is what you are put into. And what tends to happen is that people who are born to people who are already in a certain class test into that class, you know? So it ends up just sort of eliminating what, you know, I could argue is already an American lie, but eliminating this idea that we have of America as a meritocracy and America as a place of like shifting class, and where you can just as easily rise as you can fall, and you can work up to this and work up to, like, it's actually, that is a fallacy that like, it's that tracking is like tracking in schools is an example of like where that fallacy like becomes very, very apparent, because you have like people who are born into a station and then like, you know, they test and like, that's the thing that they know how to do. That's the thing that they're good at. You know, you might like, your mother might have cleaned hotels, and like, you might, you know, get to a place where like you're the hostess at a restaurant, and that can be seen as like a step up in some regards, right? Or maybe you're managing the cleaning staff at the hotel, and that's seen as a step up in some regards. But in actuality, like, your family has stayed in that same service class. and that mobility hasn't actually changed. And that's the part about tracking that worries me. And like where my lament for, I think, even having those kids in the same school, you know what I mean? Like physically next to each other. Where like, even if I'm not taking woodshop, like if I'm taking computer science, like my friend might be taking woodshop and we might get on the same bus or walk home together every day. You know what I mean? Like it's just, it creates an even bigger gap in the ability of like the classes to interact, and I think therefore the ability for like people to actually like respect each other.
Yeah.
You know?
No, because I think that is a major issue here, is that, again, this isn't solely here, because I think this is also, as we saw with the Meghan and Harry interview a few months ago, a huge problem in England, but I think they have a very different class system over there. So that's a different thing. But I think here specifically, it's very classist, and I feel like the race and class and the way they interact here in the US is very very specific. But I do think that people forget about the class aspect of things here, and to be fair, I think they want you to, so that's why. But I do think, yeah, what you're saying is correct, where a lot of people, if you are not from the same class, you have no real interaction until maybe you go to a certain, if you're somebody in the lower, or working class, lower class, whatever, is typically if you manage to go up and like go to a college or something, or you go to a high school, you manage to get into a high school or a prep school or whatever, that's when you tend to have the same interaction. And typically the only way that a higher class person would have a connection with a lower class person is if that person's helping them out in some way. So whether that be like helping them house, domestic assistant, whatever it is. So I do completely agree with you. I think it does further stratify people. And it's done on purpose though, just like the way that all of our countries are made, like the class system is supposed to be upheld, and school is the main way to do it. I think schools and housing and all of that are all tied into one another. So yeah, it's a system that's supposed to be upheld. It's working exactly as it was planned to.
Exactly. And I mean, and I also do just want to make it clear that I think in the same way that like there is no inherent good or bad in like gender traits, you know what I mean? Or traits that are typically associated with gender,
yeah.
like or like, with various genders. Like there, like I don't think that like there is no inherent, like I don't think that to be service is to actually be lower than managerial, right? Like I don't think that there's actual inherent like fundamental good and bad, or like dregs of society versus not, like in like being in part of whatever class, right? But like society has made decisions about that outside of that, and like I don't think that there's anything wrong with being a service worker. Like my mother was a service worker. I was a service worker you know what I mean? Like I've had jobs where I was a service worker. Like make an argument about all agents being service workers, but like, you know what I mean? They make some good money, but like, like it's not any issue with like the profession, but I do have an issue with the idea that like it's been chosen for you.
Right.
Like I just always like, we're like, it's been chosen for you before you had any concept that you were even being given a choice, or that someone was like looking at you and making
it's very free will versus predetermined. Because it's like, then you get into the question. Yeah,
predeterminism.
Then you get into the question of, do we really have free will? Yeah. But we don't have to get into that. That's a whole
like, and not just in a cosmic sense, but walking down the street.
It gets into that, because I think it's also hard because people see the outliers and they think that's the rule, and it's like, no, they are the exception to the rule. The people that manage to get from, what is considered like a working or lower class and come all the way up is not common, and that's completely an outlier. Most people don't have that experience, and I think that's the one thing to also drill home. So it's like, you can't look at like all these like a LeBron James and be like, he was working class in Cleveland, single mother family, and he managed to make it, and now he's this multimillionaire. And it's like, the amount of there's a variety.
Yeah, but the boy's also huge and physically like
him
like
being super
not...
talented, and then also being extremely determined and disciplined. So
exactly,
you know, again,
exactly.
paths.
And a lot of times you can't afford to be disciplined if you're just trying to eat. Like again, like you know, it becomes a lot of stuff goes into it.
Right. So yes, all of that to say that we need to lessen the stratification as much as we can. And right.
On
and
all
that's
fronts,
also not saying like
you know,
us adding wood shop and home ec back to schools is going to be the thing, the like silver bullet to end that. But I do think that it is one of those things that could be it could be helpful. I think kids would appreciate it, especially now. I feel like a lot of the Gen Zers are very, you know, on the cutting edge. As most new generations are.
I know, I know a lot of schools are trying to do a lot more like financial literacy
that
stuff.
Is a whole other conversation.
No, I was about to say, but like that is also like we
it's
talk
related, about that, but yeah, that's a whole other conversation about the lack of that.
Yeah, that's also
but yeah,
but yeah, I mean, what's wild is that like, you know. And I guess it's something just to like fully bring it back to this film that, you know, we're talking about, or that has led us to these places. Like, I think that there's something to be said about like why sometimes, because I know that like we've given a lot of flack, right? Like, or I mean, I feel like I have given a decent amount of flack on this podcast to like some of these movies that are like too on the nose. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? That kind of like beat you over the head with this, where you're like, all right, I get it. But like, I think that this is an example of a film that, like, when done well, is on the nose, but it's on the nose in a way that, like, it actually, like, it's a point that is like fine tuned, and it really does allow for like as we've just demonstrated. Like, I didn't expect the conversation to like sort of balloon the way it did. I'm happy that it did, but like, it is a very sort of like, it is a beating you over the head film with a very like obvious point. But like, I think because, at least in my opinion, this one is done like fairly well. It allows you to see how like films on the nose that are done well can actually be like really great catalysts for us to have like important conversations about the state of the world.
So I think,
like, I don't got no, like I said, I ain't got no answers for y'all, but you know,
right. Conversation. So I think with that, Nina, what do you show this one to your kids?
Yeah, I feel like it's one of those things of like, I think if I see it on the screen, like if I see a thumbnail, if we're like on Disney Plus, right, and I see the thumbnail, I'll be like, yo, let's watch Eddie's $1 Million Cook-Off. You know what I mean? Also just because I think it's like something I do really appreciate with this film is that like I always like films that kind of talk about like the complexity of things that we take for granted. Like I said, like, you know, my mom cooks for a living, right? Like, that's what she does, and her technique is incredible. And like, I've always known what a mirepoix was, and like I say that to other people, and they look at me like I'm crazy. But like, you know, like there are just things that I grew up knowing about cooking just because of like watching my mom do it. So I've always sort of like known that cooking. I've always known. My mom will say, cooking is about like taste and experiment, but like baking is a science. And like, they're just like things that like I've always known about the complexity of food, that I didn't always necessarily see reflected. And I like, this is a movie that reflects that. And I think that like any movie that does that with anything, you know, like where you get to sort of learn about something that you might take for granted as just something that happens in the world, or that's something that's like on your table for you, you know, is always like a good thing to have. I think it's a fun film to watch. Like, I think like the cooking montages are like super fun. Watching like the disasters in the kitchen, like every kid knows that moment where like, you know, like you're helping your mom make cookies or something, and like, oh, and also because like my mom was like the main cooker of the house. There are certain things that only my father is allowed to make for us, but like my mom was the main cooker of the house, so that's why I keep saying like making cookies with my mom, because that's who I would do it with. um but like, and the flour goes everywhere, and that's like, it's like, you're like, oh, I've made a mess, but it's also like the most sort of fun mess, because like cooking is such a place of love, right? Like it comes from such a loving place, like learning to do it, and then executing it, and then like seeing people's faces when you feed them, and just like all of that, and this idea of like this being a movie about like being a good team player. And I think our whole conversation today has been about that, like being a good team player. And part of being a good team player is like not associating like bad traits with like the way that someone is born, and like not like forcing someone into a class because of how they were born, and like, what I mean, like all of this, like how to be like a good team player. um and I think it does it in a really, really fun way. So I think, yeah, I think it's something that I would like show my kids, and that like I would enjoy watching with them. And then I'd probably be like, yo, let's go have a cooking competition. Like, let's go play, Young Chopped, or whatever the thing is called. You know what I mean? Yeah, I feel like it could be a really good
Yeah, I
time.
agree. I think I would also show this one to my kids, and also just point out to them like the inherent gendering of it, because I think that's also a big thing to note. It's just being like, hey, you notice that the dad said this, like, we shouldn't say that because X, Y, and Z, just so that they get the point. And yeah, but I would definitely, I mean, this is still a fun one, still enjoyable. Like Nina said, the food montages are great. So yeah, I would also say rewatch it as an adult. If you really liked it when you were younger, you will still enjoy it, I'm sure. So definitely recommend a rewatch as well, for anybody that was a fan of it growing up. But yeah, I mean, I think with that, guys, we'll see you next week.
We will, yeah, catch you on the
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of The Critics Kingdom. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify and SoundCloud so you can stay up to date, as well as interacting and letting us know what you guys think on social media. You can find us on Twitter at Critics Kingdom and on Instagram at The Critics Kingdom. We're excited to talk to you again next week.